people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Franchon Cruz versus Cederroos. Let's talk about the fight. A fight that took place on the undercard of Taylor versus Serrano. A legendary fight in and of itself. A legendary card. This is a card that's going to leave a lasting impression in a lot of people's minds for a very long time.
This fight fought at 168 pounds.
It was for all the marbles. It was for the undisputed super middleweight championship. And in terms of entertainment value, it did not disappoint. It delivered. In terms of an aesthetic, it was everything I envisioned, everything I predicted. Cederroos, to the eye, is a very polished boxer with a very neat and tidy style that isn't hard to appreciate or interpret. But Franchon Cruz,
the pressure she applies can cause a very neat and tidy textbook style to fall apart.
come apart at the seams, and I believe that's what we saw last night as Franchon Cruz crowded Cederroos, got all in her wheelhouse.
Landed looping right hand.
After looping right hand, dipping off to her left as she brings over that big right. I told you guys ahead of this fight, I told you guys in my prediction video that Cederroos is a good textbook boxer, but her torso is a bit static. It doesn't move much, and because she's so upright, she's in line for those looping rights from Franchon Cruz. That would be an important punch in this fight, and time has proven me right, as Franchon Cruz connected with several big looping rights deep in the pocket.
Aline's face was a bloody mess.
How she didn't go down and how she didn't go out is a testament to how bad she wanted the W, how bad she wanted it. But Franchon Cruz, I figured, Franchon Cruz is going to prove to be too much for Cederroos.
So much for a lot of fighters that are around these weights.
Believe it, between the looping rights and dominating the pocket, mid-range to inside.
Honest to God, looked like a clean sweep for me.
Had Franchon Cruz winning most, if not every single round in this 10-round championship contest. Unbeknownst to most, Franchon Cruz isn't just a heavy-handed puncher. She's actually got a great gas tank.
She keep the punches coming from round 1 to round 10.
She's durable enough to take what comes back at her. Franchon Cruz takes a great punch and delivers an even better one. It's a situation to where you can't let the physically imposing stature of Cederroos fool you into thinking she's just going to go in there and out-hustle somebody like Franchon Cruz. It doesn't work that way. Franchon Cruz being the shorter fighter with the lower center of gravity, it's a harder target for someone as statuesque as Cederroos, who wants to box and throw straight punches that Franchon can slip and slide her way around.
While bringing over those big looping rights.
I was right to assume that in this fight, Franchon would be busier.
Better.
She turned this into a brawl, whereas what Aline wants to do is box.
Remember when I told you Franchon's got an uncooperative style?
Franchon's not going to let you box. She's going to crowd you, get in your wheelhouse, rough you up.
Win the rounds.
Win the fight. Franchon Cruz is now the super middleweight division's undisputed champion, establishing that lineage.
There are several fights out there I'd like to see Franchon in.
Not exclusive to a Clarissa Shields rematch, Franchon Cruz has effectively become the woman to beat at 168 pounds. And I'll tell you something, there are very few fighters at or around these weights, I think, stand a chance. Congratulations to her. The prediction stuck, and Franchon Cruz won on points. You think about Liam Smith versus Jesse Vargas. Yet another prediction that stuck. I went 5 for 5 in terms of predictions.
Yeah, I picked Liam to stop Jesse Vargas.
Yeah, Jesse didn't look half bad in the first 2 rounds, but as the fight progressed and Liam Smith started gaining momentum, crowding Jesse Vargas and backing him into those ropes, roughing him up,
Vargas was looking worse and worse round after round.
It's not hard to understand why. Jesse Vargas has only really ever lost to quality operators like Manny Pacquiao and Timothy Bradley, Mikey Gersha.
He's never been stopped, and he's a decent boxer.
A former world champion like Liam Smith, but Liam Smith is the naturally bigger fighter, more experienced at this weight, junior middleweight. Jesse Vargas, he'd been out a while. He'd been out roughly 2 years. He didn't have a fight since dropping that decision to Mikey Gersha in a fight where he was hurt by Mikey Gersha. So I tell myself, well, if Mikey Gersha, a little guy who moved up to welterweight, if he packs a big enough punch to hurt you and have you on Quiz Street, even if it's just for a little while, a guy like Liam can do a little better than that because he's a naturally bigger guy than Mikey and a naturally bigger guy You are.
You know what he did? He outmuscled Jesse Vargas.
A bit tentative at the start and a bit too tentative at times. You could tell that Liam was pressuring Jesse Vargas to throw by crowding him, coming forward,
Catching shots on the glove so he could return fire.
let off counter shots, hit Jesse Vargas with punches he doesn't see. At times, it almost looked like even though Liam was backing Jesse Vargas off and he was clearly the stronger of the two, at times it did look like he was letting Jesse Vargas lead the dance. But I told you, Jesse couldn't keep this a boxing match for the full course.
No, I didn't think he'd be able to because he hadn't fought in 2 years.
And Liam Beefy Smith is a physical kind of fighter that's going to test your physical fitness. So what's your fitness like after 2 years?
2 years of inactivity.
Saw some very good jabs from Smith, the Liverpool man that snapped Jesse Vargas's head back. Some good uppercuts mid-range to inside. The fight was really getting away from Jesse Vargas, and it was obvious. I want to say that from rounds 8 to round 10, when the fight was stopped,
Jesse's legs looked unsteady and he looked ready to go.
because Liam Smith was at times letting him lead the dance, looking to bait Jesse to throw so he could counter what he puts out there, counter what he throws. I think that bought Jesse a little bit more time, that at times, because Liam is being tentative, that's why Jesse's still in this fight. If Liam hits the gas a little more, he'll get the guy out of there. That's what he did in the 10th. He really started laying into Jesse.
Yeah, Jesse had nothing left. He couldn't fight his way off those ropes.
Liam Smith has been looking progressively better, fight by fight, even though he lost that decision to Kurbanov on paper in a fight most people thought he won. He looked sharp, he looked strong against Anthony Fowler, and he looked strong and sharp last night against Jesse Vargas. There are several different prospects on the horizon for Liam Smith, who, unless I'm mistaken, expressed some interest in facing Australia's own unbeaten up-and-comer, Tim Tszyu.
Ooh, I could go for a fight like that.
Or Liam Smith versus Kell Brook. Kell Brook was supposed to be in negotiations to face Chris Eubank Jr., but that fight hasn't been finalized yet. It's not official.
Smith versus Brock makes more sense than Eubank versus Brock.
We'll see how it shakes out. We'll see what happens. For now, congratulations to Liam Smith. The prediction stuck, and he ended up overwhelming Jesse the way I thought he'd end up overwhelming Jesse. We come to the main event of that same card. A surefire fight of the year candidate and a monumental fight, a milestone fight overall for the sport. Taylor versus Serrano, a fight that I think has left us with a lot to reflect upon, a lot to discuss. This being the weekend recap video, though, we'll just talk about the fight. We'll talk about the fallout afterwards. For now, let's talk about how I scored this thing. I scored this thing the way many of you out there scored this thing. 6 rounds to 4 in favor of Katie Taylor, with Katie Taylor picking up the first 2 rounds and sweeping the last 4. Amanda had a long spell where she was bossing it. Started around round 3, and Katie started pulling away in round 7.
The prediction stuck, but there were some surprises.
The build-up of this fight, I told you guys that power isn't everything. Power in and of itself doesn't always win fights because it's your ability to deliver that power, the land punches, hard ones, that determines what happens. And in the first 2 rounds, you saw Katie Taylor moving and punching, using the ring and using those legs as Amanda Serrano advanced, missing shots, quite a few. I gave the first round to Katie and the second round to Katie, though
Amanda looked better in the second round than she did in the first.
better still, I gave that second round to Katie Taylor on the heels of her movement, counter shots, walking Amanda into punches as Amanda attempted to close the gap. Amanda touched her a bit in that second round. I gave Amanda the third.
The third round ended up being a more important round than people realize.
In the moment it did, because towards the end of that third round, which I scored for Amanda Serrano, I saw Amanda connect with a straight left hand towards the end of it. And when she connected with that straight left hand, I didn't like Katie Taylor's body language. I didn't like how she looked receiving that shot, receiving that punch towards the end of the round. And from then on, Katie's legs looked unsteady. She wasn't moving the same way she was in rounds 1 and 2. Her equilibrium seemed off. I scored rounds 3 and 4 for Amanda.
Had it 2 rounds to 2 after 4.
3 rounds to 2 after 5. 5 rounds. The punishing 5th round that I think stood out to a lot of people. The 5th round that I think most people will reference whenever this fight is brought up. In the 5th round, Amanda Serrano came very close to stopping Katie
It's
Taylor.
arguably the most dramatic round of the whole fight, save the 10th and final round.
Like I said, Katie Taylor wasn't moving as much in rounds 4 and 5 as she was in rounds 1 and 2.
We saw Amanda Serrano pin her down in the corner and unload a lot of hard shots.
They got into an exchange that Amanda Serrano seemed to have been getting the better of. In the 5th round, you saw Amanda Serrano badly bloody Katie Taylor. Almost put her down, almost put her out. How Katie kept her composure, how she stayed on her feet, being on the receiving end of so many hard shots, so many hard punches. Well, that's where experience comes into it. This ain't her first rodeo with a hard puncher. Delphine Persoon,
Yep.
Jessica McCaskill,
Yep.
Christina Lenardatu,
Yep.
Natasha Jonas. This is where, having been in the trenches before,
She didn't panic. She knew what to do.
she held on, tied Amanda Serrano up, attempting to smother her work and survive what was a very punishing fifth round. I had Amanda Serrano winning rounds 3, 4, and 5.
Punishing fifth round for Katie Taylor.
I can't stress that enough. And I had Amanda Serrano picking up the 6th round as well. I had Amanda Serrano winning 4 out of 10 rounds in this fight, but Katie in the 6th.
The 6th round wasn't as arduous for Katie as the 5th round was, though I still had Amanda winning
In the
it.
7th, Katie Taylor seemed to have gotten her legs back, and that's where she started pulling away from Amanda, at least on my card, moving and punching, being more judicious, and not attempting to trade punches with what appeared to be the harder puncher. There have been question marks around Amanda Serrano as to whether or not the power would be bankable in this fight, and it appears that it was.
I told you, Katie's best weapon in this fight ain't her hands.
It's her feet, and it would be her feet that wins her a points decision. It would be her feet that wins her this fight, because once her feet were back under her in the 7th,
That's when she pulled away from Amanda.
rounds 7, round 8, both of which I gave to Katie Taylor, were nowhere near as dramatic as that 5th round where Katie Taylor was bludgeoned by Amanda Serrano, but there's still rounds that Katie Taylor won, and I think what people need to understand is the round doesn't need to be dramatic.
You don't need to win the round emphatically to win the round.
Though so long as you win the round, you're in the fight. And after 8 rounds, I had it 4 rounds to 4. 5 rounds to 4 after 9 in a fight where Katie turned the tide.
She got her legs back, and she was back in the fight.
Though she hadn't really hurt Amanda Serrano up until that point. It wasn't up until the 10th round that you saw Amanda Serrano start to wilt. The 10th round was just as dramatic as the 5th round, but Katie Taylor was on the better end of those exchanges, the winning end.
With that 10th and final round, I had Katie Taylor winning it 6 rounds to 4.
And I repeat, it was Katie Taylor's legs that won her this fight, more than her speed, more than her power. If things went the way they went from round 3 to round 6, I think it's because Katie received a straight left hand,
Equilibrium was off, and I think that's why she stopped moving.
and as soon as she stopped moving, movement being her bread and butter, Amanda Serrano was really able to pile up the points and inflict some damage, get off some really hard shots, because Katie's not moving.
Pinned down in that corner.
Doesn't get said enough is that Katie Taylor, in spite of looking human at times, she's looking human against quality competition, top shelf opponents, and she's exhibited time and time again. She can take a great punch, but even if she's hurt, she can survive.
Kind of poise that experience gives you.
That know-how. Moving those legs, moving those feet, and using that ring. Walking Amanda into shots while Amanda misses her own shots. That's what won Katie Taylor this fight and kept her in it at a time where she was badly hurt and badly bloody.
She bloodied up Amanda in the 10th.
Was Katie Taylor on the better end of those exchanges. She almost lost her footing in the heat of the exchange, but that wasn't as a result of a punch. She was simply off balance, though she didn't.
Neither her knee or her glove touched the canvas, so it wasn't a knockdown.
It's honestly one of the best fights I've ever seen. You wondered if it would live up to the hype, given that the fight was being billed as the biggest fight in the history of women's boxing, and it was much more than just that.
Fights rarely live up to the hype, you know.
Build up for Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao took about 5 years, but when the fight took place,
It wasn't exactly exciting. It wasn't an action fight.
this was. And even though Katie Taylor was awarded the decision and Amanda Serrano was not, there were no losers here.
The sport of boxing, the fighters, and anybody that saw this fight won last night.
This was boxing in its finest hour, boxing at its best. And when boxing's at its best, there's no other sport quite like it.
Congratulations to the fighters.
Because the prediction stuck, congratulations to Katie Taylor. She lived up to my expectations, and Amanda exceeded them. Post-fight, there were some gripes from Jake Paul, who turned to the punch stats for consolation, saying Amanda Serrano outlanded Katie Taylor in landed punches, both to the body and the head. Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And to that, Ebony Bridges, reigning IBF bantamweight champion Ebony Bridges, quite stoutly stated, no, Jake, I'm sorry, but it don't work like this. If boxing was just judged on total punches landed at the end of the fight, we wouldn't need judges, just a tally. This post shows how little you know about boxing, and I actually like what you're doing for women's boxing, but no, this post is casual as fuck.
You can outland the other fighter in total punches landed once the fight is over.
But if the bulk of those punches were in a particular set of rounds, what happens with the other rounds? You know, a lot of people are focusing on what took place in rounds 5 and 6, not realizing there were 4 more rounds after that.
Even if all of them weren't as dramatic as the 5th.
There were 4 more rounds after that. But you know, That was expected, that kind of reaction. As was the outcome of Stevenson versus Valdez, the final fight of the night that wasn't quite the barn burner in any way, shape, or form that Taylor versus Serrano was, and I wasn't expecting it to be. I figured, Oscar Valdez is a good fighter, don't get me wrong. A two-division champion leading up to this fight, but he just ain't got the chops to get Shakur out of his comfort zone. Shakur's too fast with the jab, too fleet of foot with his feet.
I've told you guys several times on several different channels.
Skilled boxer that Shakur Stevenson might be, this fight and the contrasting styles has the potential to be anticlimactic, the opposite of what we saw in Taylor versus Serrano, because Oscar just ain't got what it takes to make Shakur uncomfortable. Between a judicious lead hand, a southpaw jab, and a half step back, Shakur's going to manage the distance. He's going to control Oscar. And outside of a few bursts of ineffective aggression from Oscar, trying to land and trying to land big, this was Shakur's fight to win or lose. And I picked him to win the fight. That's what he did.
Not a hard prediction to make and not a hard fight to score.
Far from it. A big part of the reason that Shakur Stevenson is such an educated boxer isn't what he's offering you so much as what he isn't offering you. He's got speed, but he's not in love with it, to where he's putting together 3 and 4 punch combinations, to where maybe the first 2 punches land, but you can time the third.
He doesn't give you that.
He doesn't give you that to work with and build upon. If he can win the fight off the lead hand alone, that's what he'll do, occasionally bringing over a straight left up top or a straight left downstairs. And that was really the story of this fight, outside of a few bursts of aggression from Oscar, who was lunging in, couldn't find his range, couldn't really land much of substance. It was Shakur Stevenson in full control of what was a thinking man's fight.
Taylor versus Serrano was a really hard act to follow.
Stevenson versus Valdez being the final fight of the night into the wee hours of the morning. Taylor versus Serrano was action from start to finish. In truth, the entire Matchroom card and all those fights were action fights from start to finish. Whereas Valdez versus Stevenson, that was always going to be a cerebral fight. That was always going to be a thinking man's fight. And I said as much on several channels, including this one.
This fight has the potential to be an anticlimactic fight.
It's not saying that Shakur Stevenson isn't supremely skilled. He is now this division's unified champion. He is skilled. He is all those things and more, but that doesn't necessarily make him all that entertaining.
Oscar didn't have what it takes to make the fight entertaining because he didn't have what it takes to get Shakur out of his comfort zone.
And that's not even saying that this fight was a bad fight so much as this being the final fight of the night, Taylor versus Serrano, and just that entire card, it was a hard act to follow.
Oscar's a good fighter, and for what it's worth, I still think he's got plenty of good fights left out there for him.
Because he is an entertaining fighter to watch, even if he is a less skilled fighter than the fighter that beat him last night, Shakur Stevenson, who is now this division's Ring Magazine, WBC, and WBO super featherweight champion. Congratulations to him on 2 bigger and better things.
I ain't got too many thoughts on this thing to reflect upon because this is what I expected.
Stevenson on points in one-sided fashion.